Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. First, the headlines. Still monitoring developments out of Ukraine, and Russian President Vladimir Putin accused of sowing seeds of catastrophe for himself by invading Ukraine as he signs decree on retaliatory sanctions. The United Kingdom announces £300 million package for Ukraine in the coming weeks, with more arms on the way. Plus, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expected in Nigeria on the last leg of his West Africa tour. Thanks again for joining us. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree on what the Kremlin has described as unfriendly actions of certain foreign states and international organizations. The document, however, does not provide any details of which individuals or entities may be affected by the measures. The decree forbids the export of products and raw materials to people and entities that it has sanctioned. It also prohibits transactions with foreign individuals and companies hit by Russia's retaliatory sanctions and permits Russian counterparties not to fulfill obligations towards them. The decree says the Russian government has 10 days to compile lists of foreign individuals and companies to be sanctioned, as well as to define additional criteria for a number of transactions that could be subject to restrictions. Well, Russia is in another hot water with Israel over comments by its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, for saying German dictator Adolf Hitler had Jewish blood and that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, condemned Mr. Lavrov for the comment and demanded an apology, as Lavrov had made both an unforgivable and outrageous statement, as well as a terrible historical error, saying the Jews did not murder themselves in the Holocaust. Russia's foreign ministry now accuses the Israeli minister of making anti-historical statements. Russia has repeatedly made baseless claims that the Ukrainian government is run by neo-Nazis as a justification for its invasion. Analysts think the war of words between Israel and Russia risks becoming the most serious diplomatic crisis between the two countries in recent times. In other developments, French President Emmanuel Macron has held a 2-hour call with his Russian counterpart. Now, Macron's last conversation with President Putin was on March the 29th. Both had been in touch via telephone. Before then, Macron had said his telephone calls with Putin concerned him and were not pleasant. His hopes for a ceasefire had appeared dim in the context of what was happening on ground in Ukraine, citing atrocities against civilians by Russian forces in Bucha, and that France was gathering evidence in Russia's actions as a crime should not go unpunished. Macron's efforts at keeping open communication with the Russian leader had led to criticism by some, both at home and abroad. And Pope Francis has decided to join in efforts at getting the Russian president to reconsider the invasion in Ukraine. Earlier today, he told an Italian newspaper that he had sent a message to the Kremlin 20 days after the Russian invasion via the Vatican's diplomat, offering to travel to Moscow to meet President Putin to discuss the war in Ukraine, but has not heard back. This is the first time the pontiff has mentioned Russia or publicly named Putin since the start of the war 2 months ago. But Francis said he had recently had a 40-minute Zoom call with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, and says that he spent the first 20 minutes of the call reading out all the justifications for it. But Francis said the Patriarch cannot transform himself into Putin's altar boy. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK will be sending more arms to Ukraine in the coming weeks as part of a £300 million support package. He was addressing MPs a few hours ago, telling them the UK will send Brimstone anti-ship missiles and Stormer anti-aircraft systems, along with armoured vehicles to evacuate civilians from areas under attack and protect officials. According to the Prime Minister, the support package will include radars to pinpoint the artillery bombing Ukrainian cities, heavy lifting drones to supply Ukrainian forces and thousands of night vision devices. These, he says, will aid the UK's long-term goal to fortify Ukraine and prevent future attacks.
In military history about the future, I have one message for you today. Ukraine will win. And they said that this Rada of yours would have to be reformed outside Ukraine, maybe even in Poland or in London, perhaps. And I refused to believe it. And today you have proved them completely wrong. Every one of those military experts who said that Ukraine would fall. Glorious chapters in military history and in the life of your country. The so-called irresistible force of Putin's war machine has broken on the immovable object of Ukrainian patriotism and love of country. This is Ukraine's finest hour that will be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Your children and your grandchildren will say that Ukrainians taught the world that the brute force of an aggressor counts for nothing against the moral force of a people determined to be free. As you turned the Russian army back from the gates of Kyiv, you not only accomplished one of the greatest feats.
In the meantime, normal diplomatic relations are slowly returning to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, the latest being the UK's ambassador to Ukraine, Melinda Simmons. Ambassador Simmons has described seeing shock upon shock on the road in Kyiv as she and her staff return to the Ukrainian capital.
We drove through that, of course, because if you take the car, you come, into Kyiv Oblast, then you can see just how hard Russia tried to take Kyiv, and also just how quickly the focus became on hitting civilians and attacking civilians. And that is shock upon shock. We passed, bombed out playgrounds, bombed out schools, hospitals, burned out trees, twisted metal in farmland. So obvious, really, that right from the beginning, this was about hitting the Ukrainian nation. It wasn't just about taking out the military capability. This was my home. For 2.5 years, it's been my home. And I've travelled this country, north, south, east and west of it. I've got to know it incredibly well. I know many people who are fighting, and I know wives and children of people who are fighting. It's incredibly emotional for me, and also for my British friends and colleagues, for me to be here. It means an enormous amount for me to be here. I think that speaks to their inability to understand how Ukrainians value their nationhood. This is Ukrainians defending themselves against an invasion so that they can live peacefully. There's nothing more than that.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine hopes to return to Kyiv by the end of this month if conditions permit, so says the Charge d'Affaires. U.S. diplomats departed the Kyiv Embassy nearly 2 weeks before Russia launched its invasion February 24th.
I would say the message to Russia is you failed. Ukraine is still standing, the government is still functioning, and we're going back to Lviv first and then Kyiv to help the government. Today is my first day back in Ukraine, and we're doing it as a day trip. We expect to continue to do day trips for the next week or two. And then we very much hope that the conditions will permit us to go back into Kyiv by the end of the month.
The Danish embassy also reopened Monday following its closure immediately after Russia's invasion. The Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs made the announcement when he visited the Ukrainian president in Kyiv. He described the move as a very strong symbol of the Danish support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
Thank you very much.
Now, according to one analysis, the EU has spent more than 47 billion euros, that's about 39.4 billion pounds, on Russian fossil fuels since the invasion began. Last month, the bloc's top diplomat pointed out that the 1 billion euros being sent every day to Russia in form of energy payments was 35 times more than the sum the EU had actually donated to Ukraine to help it defend itself. The EU is worried its dependence on Russian fossil fuels is inadvertently helping the Kremlin to fund the invasion of Ukraine because a significant proportion of the payments are taken by the Russian government in tax. In fact, in 2021, the International Energy Agency estimated that revenue from oil and gas made up 45% of Russia's federal budget. Hungary has reiterated that it opposes a ban on either fuel. And you'll see that Germany is the world's top importer of Russian gas in 2020, and this is buying 42.6 billion cubic meters, and this according to the International Energy Agency. Hungary, too, was one of Russia's top gas buyers, taking 11.6 billion cubic meters that year. The European Union as a whole bought 41% of its gas from Russia in 2021. Well, joining us for more on that is Mr. Tilewa Adebajo. He's the CEO of CFG Advisory and also an economist. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Welcome. Should the EU go ahead with a ban on Russian oil, do you think?
Well, at this moment, it's very difficult to ban Russian oil. There's this issues around energy security. There are contracts in place, and any ban might lead to a breach of those contracts, and the penalties can indeed be very severe. So it's going to be very difficult at this present moment to do the ban. So I think over a period of time, maybe about a year or so, then I think the EU as a whole can begin to shift their dependence. This also raises a question of energy security, because as you know, most people have been moving towards renewables, and it's clear that renewables are not just ready. And I think even the EU are going to be looking more in the areas of nuclear power and other alternative sources of power, especially nuclear, to be able to bridge this gap. And I think this is going to have long-term consequences on these issues of energy security.
But when you hear what countries, some countries in the EU are saying, and this is also especially Germany, saying that it's not against the ban, but then, you know, a sort of stoppage might really affect it, but then is willing to go, the whole with whatever decision the EU decides. Where do you think they're getting that from?
Well, first of all, Germany is the most vulnerable at the moment in terms of their dependence on Russian oil and gas. So obviously, they're going to be looking at alternatives, but they're also within the European Union. So while Germany is going to be pushing for significant changes and looking for alternative sources, it still has to carry the European Union along in terms of their overall energy strategy and the overall energy security for the European Union.
Yes, and, you know, the European Union also, they're expected to do a lot more this week, and they call it the sixth package of EU sanctions against Russia. What's your take so far? Are these sanctions having any impact? And this is also seeing what Russia has done today, and that is a decree, a sort of retaliatory measure to firms, companies that are taking, maybe unfriendly companies and that are taking this sanctions against it. if we see an embargo on buying Russian oil, how much of a blow do you think also this would deal to Russia in terms of the revenue that's accruing to it at this point?
Well, there's no doubt that Russia has lost maybe about 40% of its revenues as a whole in terms of the impact as to what's going on right now. But as you know, most of the European countries are still paying Russia for this. And the ban, it's not going to affect it until maybe a year down the line. So eventually, Russia is going to be hurting. And of course, the EU countries also are going to be hurting because they're going to be looking for alternative sources of energy from newer suppliers, which invariably is going to be more expensive. So in a trade war, nobody wins because the whole of the global economy is about dependence. Many countries have resources that other countries don't have. So there's this interdependence with the global trade. Some people have comparative advantage in certain areas and some people don't. And that's the whole essence of global trade. And invariably, both countries are going to suffer from this, not only Russia, but the EU. But again, the EU is going to now begin to take more significant and concrete steps, as I said earlier, to begin to secure its energy security and maybe look towards nuclear fuel more than anything else.
And Hungary doesn't, of course, agree with the EU's position, and they're clearly stating that. I wanted to take you to perhaps some of the impacts of the Ukraine war, and this is what we've heard from the IMF, Sub-Saharan Africa. We were told that a promising regional recovery has been disrupted by that war in Ukraine. Last year, I think the projected growth was from 3.7 to 4.5%, but now the war has sort of introduced a new development saying that 2022 will slow to 3.8%. What do you see ahead for Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, to be honest with you, I think Sub-Saharan Africa is not really impacted significantly by this war. I think the biggest countries that have issues with this are Egypt, is a big importer of grain from Russia and Ukraine. Then there's the iron and steel. But again, there are many other alternative sources for these products. There's an inflationary impact globally. But again, yes, because of the slowdown of global trade and global economy, sub-Saharan African economies are going through a recovery period. And I think the biggest threats, even to the sub-Saharan economies, are the high prices of oil, which is really what's going to impact more of the sub-Saharan economies more than anything else. The war might be the cause of the price increases in oil, but again, I think we'll see some adjustments going further. But there are many things that we can do in terms of structural reforms within the sub-Saharan economic continent to be able to buffer ourselves from the impact of these this downturn that's been caused by the war, namely increase in oil gas prices and increase in the prices of food commodities, specifically wheat, and also in terms of iron and steel products.
And this is what you think policymakers should be doing, seeing as the prospects for borrowing costs, global demand are becoming increasingly uncertain. But if you were to look at Nigeria and, its effects, what would your advice be for policymakers here?
Well, it's ironic for Nigeria in terms of when you talk about advice for Nigeria, because oil prices at $100 a barrel should be a time whereby we're having a windfall and we should be happy about what is coming through. But unfortunately, we're paying $4 trillion in subsidies, which is a significant amount of money. And so this is we're not putting ourselves in the best position. There's a lot of fiscal restructuring that needs to happen in Nigeria. 80 to 85% of our revenues are going towards debt service, which is not sustainable. And the debt service numbers are becoming high. Our debt numbers have gone over $100 billion. We still have about 20 trillion naira ways and means financing within the Central Bank of Nigeria. that still needs to be reconciled and which is causing inflation. So there are many issues in Nigeria that are internal. But the fact is that at this point in time, $100 barrel oil should be in our favor. But unfortunately, because of the way we've managed our fiscal management has resulted in the fact that we're not benefiting from this. So it's important that some of this subsidy, even if not all, is removed for us to be able to restructure and give us some headroom to be able to put money into productive sectors of the economy that will grow it in a sustainable manner.
Right, perhaps that's also not what a lot of people would want to hear, you not being in favour of subsidy, seeing as Labour
but that's the reality. Unfortunately, that's the reality we face in Nigeria today. And I think it's important that Nigerians should know that 4 trillion naira is a hell of a lot of money to be paying on subsidies. That money can build at least 2 refineries.
All right, we always appreciate your time on the program. Thank you, Mr. Tiliwa Adebajo, CEO, CFG Advisory and economist. Always a pleasure having you join us on the program.
Thank you very much, Millicent.
Coming up after the break. A group of researchers in China are using technology to find solutions to curbing the coronavirus pandemic. We have that and more when we return. Well, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said that no one could assume that Russia would not attack other countries, and Germany would support Finland and Sweden if they decided to join NATO. Mr. Scholz told reporters after hosting the Swedish and Finnish leaders at a 2-day cabinet retreat north of Berlin. He said that if the two countries decide they should join the NATO alliance, then they can count on Germany's support. Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin said the European Union sanctions against Russia should be expanded, while Swedish Premier Magdalena Andersson vowed to increase her country's defense spending to 2% of the GDP as soon as it's practically possible.
Whether Finland's decision will be joining NATO or not, it will be based on our will to contribute to our common security. Opportunity to address the German government in this setting. This was a confidential and open. Germany's leadership is now more important than ever in this current situation. The EU sanction regime against Russia has already started to show its effects, and it's necessary to continue expanding the sanctions. Russia needs to understand that we are in this for the long term.
Sweden is, as other countries, adapting to the new circumstances. The build-up of our national defense is being accelerated, and we are mirroring the German bold decision to increase our defense expenditures to 2% of GDP, and we will do this as soon as it's practically possible.
Here on the continent, Al-Shabaab militants have targeted an African Union base in central Somalia that houses Burundian soldiers. According to witnesses, there was heavy fighting at the base, which is some 130 kilometers northeast of the capital, Mogadishu. Militant group Al-Shabaab claims it has taken complete control of the base. The African Union force, now known as ATMIS, is made up of soldiers from several African nations: Uganda, Burundi, Djibouti, Kenya, and Ethiopia. It supports the Mogadishu government in its fight against Al-Shabaab militants and has been the target of attacks before. The UN Secretary-General will be arriving in Nigeria today for the last leg of his West Africa tour. It will be his first visit to Nigeria as Secretary-General. On his itinerary is a visit to families affected by the Islamist insurgency in the northeast. During the visit, lasting just over 24 hours, Mr. Guterres will hold talks with President Muhammadu Buhari on the impact of food and energy price increase worsened by the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Guterres' three-nation tour began in Senegal, where he said the war in Ukraine was aggravating a triple crisis: food, energy, and the financial for the region and well beyond. He said Africa's food security problems will not be solved without reintegrating the agricultural production of Ukraine and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets, and that he was determined to do everything to facilitate a dialogue that can help achieve the objective. He then shared an iftar dinner with President Macky Sall. And he, of course, went on to Niger, where he expressed concern over increasing number of terrorist attacks in the Sahel region of the continent. After his meeting with President Mohamed Bazoum, he said the international community must realize that terrorism is not just a regional African issue, but one that threatens the whole world. Well, joining me now to talk more about the UN Secretary-General's visit is Nigeria's former ambassador to the United Nations in Switzerland. He was also a former deputy head of mission in Kyiv, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogo. Thank you for joining me on the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Welcome, Ambassador. Let's begin with the timing of the Secretary-General's visit, coming right after his Europe tour, where he met with leaders in Turkey, Russia, and, of course, Ukraine. How significant is his timing?
Well, I would say it's quite significant in the sense that the problem in Europe now, in Ukraine, is challenging not just Europe, but the whole world. And it's and Africa seems to be, even though it's not an African problem yet, Africa will be at the receiving end of some of the negative outcomes of that crisis. And it's quite interesting that the Secretary General chose to come our way, almost taking up from there, coming to Africa or West Africa. So I would say it's quite important.
And you know that during his visit to Senegal and to Niger, he highlighted the impact of the war in Ukraine in Africa. In Senegal, he talked about the triple crisis: food, energy, finance for the region and well beyond. How would you rate the UN's interventions in tackling these issues?
Well, through its various agencies, they have been doing their best, but the UN is in itself limited in what it can do. It tends to respond to some of these challenges. Take energy, for instance. There probably wouldn't have been a problem if not for the war, the crisis in Ukraine. Energy challenges have a life of their own, and it's either supply of crude oil or something else. But these are dealt at the multilateral economic levels and so on. It wouldn't be much of the UN in itself wouldn't do much to change it. But there are already mechanisms to deal with it. But the area that I would say that the UN has a role to play is handling the matters of security, because security impacts on all these issues, whether it's energy or food. Like what is happening in Ukraine, Ukraine is a food basket to the world. Now it cannot produce as much as it does or it did. That's giving rise to food concerns about food. And if there wasn't that crisis, or if there had been a way to deal with it much earlier than they're trying to do now, there would have been we wouldn't have, at least the challenge of food security would have been less, a bit less, much less, and the same thing with other issues. So essentially, the UN has a limited scope to deal with some of these challenges. But with using some of the agencies that are related to the UN, they are doing quite a lot so far, or rather have done so well in the past, dealing with matters pertaining to food, energy, humanitarian and economic issues.
I know perhaps one of the fallouts, and this is of the war in Ukraine, is really the funding. Some of the agencies have cried that the war in Ukraine has sort of been like an addition to all of the crises, the world is going through, be it Yemen, the Horn of Africa, and other parts of the world. He's on his way. We understand he'll be here this evening. He perhaps will be also reiterating the same issues. We understand he'll be first going to Maiduguri, a city that has experienced the worst of terrorism and insecurity in the country. What message could, he bring in terms of raising hope in the hearts of many that the world has not forgotten about our security challenges in spite of what we're seeing in Ukraine? What should Nigeria be really looking forward to, in this visit by the UN chief?
I think what the important thing is, what can he take away from Nigeria? Nigerian government should be able to, ask for continued support or effort to deal with our own works, whatever they can do to help us in dealing with our internal security challenges, which of course has implications on humanitarian issues, food issues, and so on. We have a lot of internally displaced persons, and we would definitely need some commitment from the UN on how to manage these the challenges of internal refugees and internally displaced persons. I think that the UN Secretary General's visit would, at the end of the day, would just try to reassure many countries, especially in West Africa, that issues of security or insecurity is important. So countries that are doing things that might undermine their internal security would take heed and begin to think twice think seriously on how to manage these issues, so that at least some of the challenges that lead to the outcomes of insecurity would be ameliorated at the onset, or even without these things happening at all. So that should be one of the outcomes for his takeaway and our own takeaway too. But we'll keep telling them of our challenges. They know a lot of it, and what inputs that can be made by the UN United Nations agencies.
But also flowing from what you just said, it really reminds me of what we've seen, the different series of coups in West Africa. And the question has been, yet he has not visited any of those countries. So many might wonder, what does that say about the UN's approach to crisis on the continent, even though, on the other hand, we have some analysts who say that even though this is, he was re-elected last year for another 5-year term, it probably looks like he spent longer, perhaps 10 years even, in that seat with all of the issues around the world.
Well, there are always issues around the world, and the Secretary General is not new to them. You remember that he was also the head of the refugee agency, the UN agency that deals with refugees. I don't know why he hasn't visited those countries where they had coups, but there are other means that have been going on in dealing with the coups in those countries. For instance, the ECOWAS has done quite a lot in managing the outcome of the coups in those countries. So it's possible that the Secretary General for now is satisfied with what is happening there, or there isn't much that his personal visit can do, especially as he has his representatives in those countries and so on. So that's maybe an attempt to explain why he hasn't gone there yet. But I'm sure his eyes are on what's going on in those countries. And anyway, once he's in West Africa, he will still get briefings from those countries about whatever those countries need for now. Usually, when the security, the UN Secretary General's attentions get focused when there is when there's a crisis that will require UN intervention, in which case there's negotiation that would generate need for having a peacekeeping force and so on. So nothing to fault him yet there. We all know that the UN as an institution has a limitation in dealing with the issues that they are challenged with. That is peace and security, economic development, human rights, and so on. But they try their best to do what they can with their limited resources and the limited authority they have in dealing with these challenges.
We'd like to thank you, former Deputy Head of Mission in Kyiv, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogo. Always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you.
Well, staying on the continent, the first African plant manufacturing COVID vaccine says it may have to shut down production due to lack of demand. The pharmaceutical company Aspen Pharmacare, which has been producing Johnson & Johnson vaccines in South Africa's Eastern Cape province, now risks closure. It comes at a time when a large proportion of Africa's population remains unvaccinated. Professor Tulio de Oliveira, the director of the Center for Epidemic Response and Innovation in South Africa, says the closure could affect the production of other vaccines as well as the preparation for the next pandemic. Research is still continuing into technological innovations that help people fight the coronavirus pandemic. So it should come as no surprise when a team of researchers in Hong Kong came up with a solution to curb its spread in public spaces.
The innovative solution involves utilizing 3D printing technology to curb the spread of the coronavirus in public places, which is to replace facilities that people touch the most with antivirus ones.
In this project, we are mainly focused on the item that people will frequently touch it. For example, like the door handle or like the lift button. And they have so many different designs in the market.
The team has created an antimicrobial coating that can mix with 3D printed materials, allowing them to make antivirus objects of almost any size and shape. To make sure the effect does not wear off over time, all the products are given a series of tough stress tests.
No matter we use the sandpaper or we use the bleaching agent, if they cannot affect the antimicrobial effect.
The researchers are working with local airport authorities, property developers and government offices to put their products into use, so as to stem infection of COVID-19 and other contagious diseases.
After we end the pandemics, the flu virus and common bacteria, we can all help to control. So I hope that it will be beneficial to most people in the world.
At the same time, a cross-disciplinary team at the University of Hong Kong has developed a sewage sampling robot that may revolutionize the way health authorities track COVID-19 transmissions. It can automatically collect materials from the sewers for analysis after being hung underneath a manhole.
The sewage surveillance can help us to identify those areas with the hidden cases and cover infected person, and for the government to take some further actions.
The Environmental Protection Department and the Drainage Services Department of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Government, in collaboration with the team of the University of Hong Kong, have strengthened the sampling of sewage in all districts of Hong Kong for COVID-19 virus tests. The innovations come as Hong Kong is showing signs of recovery from its worst wave of COVID-19 infections, which peaked in March.
Still ahead on the program. She lost both her legs, but there's no stopping 23-year-old Oksana Valadina from having her first dance on her wedding day. Let's go with that. Welcome back. And news just in is that the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has arrived Nigeria, Maiduguri, that's in Borno State. His visit is part of his tour of West African countries battling insurgency. As we had earlier told you, he is scheduled to meet with President Muhammadu Buhari in Abuja and also hold conversations with victims of terror. And let's continue in China. Staying with the COVID-19 pandemic, Beijing residents have stepped out for brief walks as the capital of 22 million tightened COVID curbs over the 5-day Labor Day holiday, keeping up with mass testing to isolate infections and avert a Shanghai-like lockdown. In a local park with a closed amusement park, residents strolled and played with young children while keeping a careful distance from one another, fearing they might receive a quarantine order if found to have been in the proximity of a COVID case. Well, separately, an official said Beijing will postpone school reopening for at least 1 week after the holiday. Beijing's new daily cases have been relatively steady since the first infections in the capital emerged on April 22, with a total of 62 detected on May the 2nd. In Shanghai, the number of cases found outside quarantine areas was up to 73, up from 58, a setback after 2 consecutive days of 0 such cases. And away from China, Sinn Féin's dream of a united Ireland is set to hit a milestone this week, with the former political wing of the IRA on course to triumph at elections in Northern Ireland as it bids to soon be the lead party in government on both sides of the Irish border. The one-time global political pariah has an 8-point advantage ahead of the May 5th election, according to an opinion poll today, an outcome that would almost certainly make it the British-run province's largest party for the first time. An Irish nationalist party coming out on top would represent a historic shift 24 years after the Good Friday Peace Accord ended 3 decades of sectarian bloodshed, though a referendum that could result in unity with the adjacent Republic of Ireland is likely years away. Sinn Féin senses growing momentum. The party, led by a younger generation of politicians with fewer links to the IRA's campaign, responsible for more than half of the 3,600 killings during Northern Ireland's troubles, wants the Irish government to start planning for the possibility of a border poll. A pre-election canvass in the patchwork constituency of North Belfast suggests breaking away from Britain is not at the top of voters' minds.
I think unionists are very concerned about what a Sinn Féin victory in this election would mean in terms of their divisive border poll plans. That's why we've put forward an effective 5-point plan that we believe address all of the issues that matter to people right across Northern Ireland. I'm not contemplating defeat in this election. We're going out to win. I want to go forward as the First Minister for Northern Ireland so that we can move forward together. After the election, we want to see rapid progress in addressing the issues that need to be resolved, not least in relation to the protocol. We want the government to act quickly, and if the EU aren't prepared to agree to remove the Irish Sea border for goods that are moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and staying within the UK internal market, then clearly the UK government must take unilateral action, which it's his right to do under the protocol itself.
I'm less fixated on dates and more concerned about the planning. The work needs to happen, the constitutional change conversation must be had, the health service conversation must be had, all those things need to happen now. But I have said that we're in a decade of opportunity to bring about that change, so we'll work towards that. I think Brexit highlights the folly of partition. Brexit highlights what's wrong with partition. It highlights the fact that we've been thrown out of the EU without our consent. And I think that the British government have played fast and loose with our futures in terms of taking us out of the EU against our wishes. So what the public here want is certainly instability, and the British government threatening to trigger Article 16 or to take unilateral action does not work in our favour. It creates more uncertainty, more instability, and that is certainly not what the public here want.
Today is World Press Freedom Day, an annual celebration of press freedom observed on the 3rd of May. It serves as a reminder to governments of the need to respect their commitment to press freedom, and is also a day of reflection among media professionals about issues of press freedom and professional ethics. The 2022 theme for the day is Journalism Under Digital Siege. According to the 2021 World Press Freedom Index, Eritrea has the worst press freedom, followed by North Korea, Turkmenistan, China and Djibouti. Europe ranks first as the region with the greatest press freedom, with Norway ranked first for press freedom. Second place is neighbouring Finland, followed by Sweden, Denmark and Costa Rica. Nigeria ranked 120 out of 180 countries in 2021. And in a hospital ward in Lviv, newlyweds Oksana Balandina and Viktor Vasiliev are finally sharing their first wedding dance. For the couple, both 23 years old, this is a moment that almost never happened. On March 27, a little over a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, as the couple were walking home in Lyshansk in Ukraine's Luhansk region, Balandina stumbled upon an unexploded mine. Vasiliev, who was walking behind her, was unhurt. What happened next was a month-long stay in various hospitals as doctors tried to treat her, while some areas in the country were under heavy shelling and attack from the Russians. Well, in the end, doctors had to amputate both her legs and 4 fingers in her left hand. She said she spent many of those days in a dark place. She said she didn't want to live. She didn't want to live such life. She has 2 children. Well, Balandina said she really thanked those who supported her. The 2 children are 7-year-old son, 5-year-old daughter, are now safe with their grandparents in Poltava region, central Ukraine. After the wedding, the couple are hoping to travel to Germany, where Balandina will get proper prosthetic legs and undergo much-needed rehabilitation. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has called Ukraine the most mine-contaminated countries in the world. I wish them well. Well, back to our breaking story today. The United Nations Secretary General Chief, he is in Nigeria. Antonio Guterres arrived in Maiduguri, the Borno state capital, and he is on a 2-day mission. Now, this will mark the first visit of the UN chief to Nigeria, who's on tour of the West African countries battling insurgency. Among his itinerary is expected to meet with families who have been affected by the Islamist insurgency in the northeast Nigeria. He'll also be having talks with the President, Muhammadu Buhari, on the impact of on Africa of the food and energy price increases worsened by the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Guterres is pushing for robust African peace initiatives as well as counterterrorism operations under the auspices of the African Union. Stay with Channels Television for more stories and updates. And of course, you can find more on our website. That's channelstv.com. That's the world today. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Oraka.